Hello and welcome to the Civil Times. Today we'll discuss the editorials of 31st January 2019. These are the articles we'll be covering today from the Hindu and the Indian Express. First, the articles of the Hindu. The first article is from the Hindu. Stormy weather awaits India in 2019. Here, the author M.K. Narayanan, who is a former National Security Advisor and the former governor of West Bengal, he points out to the harsh or the difficult external and internal situation that awaits India in 2019. Now, moving along with the article, as India prepares for the general election this year, all signs point to 2019 being a difficult year. As we enter 2019, the world outlook looks gloomy. There's a global leadership vacuum, with US abandoning its leadership role. Moreover, the US President Donald Trump's utterances and actions are provoking strong counter-reactions, in particular from China and Russia. In October 2018, the US Vice President Mike Pence's attack on China signals the arrival of the Second Cold War. Moreover, Mr. Trump has threatened to pull out of a major arms control treaty with Russia. Russia has also been talking of building a stronger deterrence. The Cold War too seems real for now. Next, the author moves on. He says, on different trajectories, nations today are working at cross purposes across the globe. Russia is vigorously pursuing its pivot to Asia and for greater influence in Eurasia. It has deepened its partnership with China, enhanced relations with Japan and South Korea. Moreover, growing tensions in the Sea of Azov following Russia's seizure of Ukraine ships could well lead to a major conflagration between Russia and the West. That is, the author M.K. Narayanan is basically pointing out that there is no common goal towards which the nations of the world are striving for. Every country is looking or striving to maximize its own national power and national influence in the global world. He has pointed the example of Russia and China. In this case, Russia's pivot to Asia, striving for greater influence in Eurasia, enhancing its partnership with China, which irritates United States of America, enhancing its relations with Japan and South Korea, and growing tensions in the Sea of Azov following Russia's seizure of Ukraine ships. Now, Ukraine has aligned with the West, especially in the view of Russia. Ukraine was formerly a part of USSR, which in 1991 broke down, and since then Ukraine, in Russia's view, has been moving out of Russia's influence and inclining towards the Western influence, which is the Western Europe as well as United States of America. This had led to a standoff between Ukraine and Russia. Now we'll discuss the Sea of Azov incident in brief. It becomes important from both geographical mapping perspective as well as the incident could be an important point to point out the rising tensions between the West and Russia and China in your mains examination. The Sea of Azov is located in between the borders of Ukraine. This is Ukraine and Russia. This entire thing is Ukraine. This is your Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. Crimea was originally a part of Ukraine. It was annexed by Russia in 2014, sensing its importance from the naval perspective. Now the incident. Now this portion also marks an important Kerch Strait. Here the Kerch Strait becomes an important. Kerch Strait basically links or divides basically Crimea from the mainland Russia. A Kerch Strait bridge was built up by Russia which basically connects the island of Crimea, not the island, it's the peninsula of Crimea with the mainland Russia. The Sea of Azov incident, we'll discuss in brief. 3 Ukrainian vessels, a tugboat and 2 gunboats had left Odessa, which is a port of Ukraine, and bound for Mariupol. Mariupol is here, and Odessa is Ukraine's main naval base since loss of Crimea, which is here. And the path towards reaching Mariupol from Odessa goes through your Kerch Strait. Now Moscow has blocked Kerch Strait with a tanker, saying Ukrainian ships entered Russian territorial waters without permission. See, the thing is, if this is your Crimea and this is your mainland Russia, this Kerch Strait bridge which is across the river is at max 33 meters in height, which makes it very difficult for large ships to pass through. So how has Russia basically blockaded this Kerch Strait for Ukrainian ships? It is by placing a tanker. This is what is being stated in the second point. Third, the Russian patrol boat seized the ships after opening fire. Now Moscow accuses Ukraine of pre-planned provocation. However, Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, claims it had informed Russians in advance of the plan to move ships. This was your Sea of Azov incident in brief. The next, China is consolidating its position in Asia. In addition to strategic partnership with Russia, China has also mended fences with Japan. China and Japan have been sort of arch rivals since World War II, after the Nanking massacre and the horrific massacres which had been inflicted by Japan and China. Moreover, the Belt and Road Initiative of China. The Belt and Road Initiative is not here. However, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive infrastructure plan of China throughout Asia as well as reaching up to Africa and China, has become the most potent weapon in China's armory, with Vietnam and Japan endorsing this concept. Basically, India, with increasing influences of Russia and China, is finding itself increasingly isolated. Economic portents during 2018 for most of the world proved very daunting. The most challenging seeing the US-China trade war, this was further compounded by a weakening Chinese economy. Now, normal economic calculations are being disrupted. Moreover, there has been a decline in Britain's financial assets and the pound sterling, which is the currency of Britain, following Brexit, as well as increasing fragility of China's economy and newer concerns. The likelihood of US moving into a period of slower long-term growth, one that is likely to continue for a fairly long time, is aggravating the situation. India cannot hope to remain insulated from these trends. Next, the author further notes that the ties with Russia and Japan are weakening, who have been its old allies, historic allies, have been weakening. Coming to India's foreign policy concerns, relations with Russia and Japan could see a reset with the strengthening of Russia and China strategic relationship and the recent warmth in the China-Japan relationships. The character of our relations with these two countries could undergo a sea change. India will need to expend a great deal of its diplomatic capital to ensure that relations do not decline to any considerable extent. Now, managing relations with China will be India's top priority. India and China relations are marked by a surface calm, according to the author, which is true, but this masks an intrinsic struggle for influence in Asia as well as beyond. The Wuhan spirit, little has changed. Since the Wuhan spirit, little has changed as far as the India-China relations are concerned, except that there has not been any major Chinese incursion across the disputed India-China border. Now, the author moves towards India's neighborhood, where our main competitor is China. Now, China's outreach in Asia and the world. China has basically initiated to increase its influence into Myanmar, a CPEC, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a massive infrastructure project in Pakistan. Yes, China has basically initiated a similar project in Myanmar, which is your China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. Moreover, the Chinese Navy is making its presence felt in the Indian Ocean. The string of pearls, and with the acquisition of Kyaukpyu port on the Arakan coast of Myanmar, China is basically trying to strangle India through its string of pearls strategy. What is the string of pearls? We'll see it on the next slide. These form your string of pearls. String of pearls are basically the ports, the important strategic ports, which China has been acquiring in India's naval neighborhood using the Belt and Road Initiative as an excuse. However, it is feared that these ports could further be used for military action. These ports extend right from Africa to the Indian Ocean. This is your Gwadar port in Pakistan, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, the Kyaukpyu port, which the author is talking about in Myanmar, as well as it has a port in Djibouti. And there are several other ports which China is planning to build surrounding the Indian Ocean. Moreover, China is also planning a Kra Canal which connects, this is your Kra Canal, which basically connects the Andaman Sea, this is your Andaman Sea, to the Gulf of Thailand. This is your South China Sea. Yeah. Now, the excuse or the reason China gives is that most of China's global trade occurs through this strait, which is your Malacca Strait, which China fears that could be blocked by US and other Western powers, or even Japan for that matter, and this could severely choke China's economy under emergency situations. Therefore, China is planning an alternative route through the Kra Canal, which basically cuts through Thailand and connects your Andaman Sea through the Sea of China, through the South China Sea or the Gulf of Thailand. Moving back, so talking further about China's outreach, China is basically has made the China-Myanmar economic corridor, and the Chinese Navy is making its presence felt. It is acquiring a string of ports in the Indian Ocean, and it is also planning a Kra Canal, and this will stranglehold across the Indian Ocean region. India's capacity to counter such moves in 2019 appears very limited. Moreover, now he moves on further in the neighborhood. He talks about Pakistan, a good neighbor, Pakistan. The author says that with the further consolidation of the all-weather friendship of China and Pakistan, during 2018, Pakistan facilitated China's involvement in Afghanistan, where there is a tripartite talk being talked about for post-US withdrawal from Afghanistan. The role that the neighbors and the central players will play in Afghanistan. The CPEC, having weathered quite a few storms, seems well to set off progress. The prospects of India-Pakistan relations improving are very limited. The cross-border terrorist attacks are likely to continue. Sponsorship of terror groups shall also continue. Where India will face even rougher weather is in Afghanistan, where the Afghan state is perilously close to imploding. This is again talking about the post-US withdrawal scenario. In Afghanistan, where it is of a high likelihood that Taliban could step up to take power from the current Afghan government, which has been instated by United States. So this is making India's position here highly invidious. Now the author further presents mixed challenges. The rest of South Asia, the outlook for India in the rest of South Asia is also mixed. India could be retrieving its position in Maldives. It has re-established its influence in Bhutan. The election of Sheikh Hasina as Prime Minister in Bangladesh has also come as a welcome relief. Yet India will need to work harder in 2019 to check China from weaning away its neighbors. And for this, there will have to be a plenty of economic and military aid for its neighbors. Next, the author moves from the external relations towards the internal security perspective. Internal security for the better part of 2018 remain on a relatively even keel. Fewer Pakistan-sponsored terror attacks. However, what was of significance or worry for India is the left extremist violence, which went up marginally in 2018. However, this movement was remained circumscribed within a core area in Chhattisgarh of Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha, and Jharkhand. However, ideologically, the movement has remained vibrant, and India will need a deft handling to counter left extremism, both ideologically as well as militarily. More challenging problems for India shall be Kashmir and Northeast. Now, the Kashmir situation, according to the author, has sharply deteriorated. The muscular approach which has been adopted by the central government is probably not working out. It has witnessed highest levels of violence since 1989. Moreover, the author points out that more educated locals are joining the militant ranks, and the presence of Islamic State in Kashmir is also being suggested. Moreover, the other challenge, which is the resurgence of ethnic subnationalism in Northeast, in particular as a response to the enactment of Citizenship Amendment Bill, which basically has created fears or led to fears in the Northeast that the arrival of migrants from the neighboring Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh will basically lead to a significant demographic change in the northeastern states, and this has basically united vast segments of people across the entire northeast. Moreover, two other issues that have continuation on the edge and which also had seen in 2018, towards the end of 2018, huge political reverses for the central government in the states of MP, Rajasthan, and Chhattisgarh were farmers and Dalits unrest. And basically, towards the end, as a conclusion, the author points out that on the diplomatic front, India shall need to be more distrust, whereas on the internal situation, the matter shall have to be dealt with a greater understanding. Now we'll move on to the next article. The case for minimum basic income. What the author basically says is that this minimum basic income will address inequality, it will alleviate rural distress and include the urban poor. Now, what is minimum basic income? As the election in 2019 is approaching, there are talks that the government could be proposing in its interim budget. Since this is an election year, a full budget won't be announced, rather an interim budget will be announced. And there are talks or rumors that the government could be proposing universal basic income as a measure to garner votes or reach the rural population where the current central government has a weak hold. Now, to counter this, the Congress President, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, has recently said that he'll be launching or he'll be coming up with a minimum income guarantee scheme. Now, what is the difference between minimum income guarantee scheme and universal basic income? Universal basic income is basically a periodic cash transfer, made to all individuals, and there is no means test criterion. That is, there is no criterion which has to be met to avail the universal basic income. It is universal. Whereas the minimum income guarantee scheme is conditional. That there is a certain criteria that will have to be met before this basic or minimum income could be availed. The author now points out for a case for the minimum basic income. The author basically says this article or this issue has been in news throughout the month, and this portion of the article is not much important. It is more of political. You can read it yourself. We'll come to the points. The author comes directly to the point. She says that the cynicism over the avant-garde policy tool of minimum income seems overblown. That is, basically there was, we'll see what the article says. A pilot project conducted between 2010 and 2013 covering 6,000 beneficiaries in Delhi and Madhya Pradesh yielded encouraging results. That is, an experiment was conducted where it was tested, which covered 6,000 beneficiaries in Delhi and Madhya Pradesh, where the minimum income project was tested or experimented, and it yielded encouraging results. It confirmed that even that at high levels of impoverishment, which is high levels of poverty, even the smallest income supplement can lead to improved nutrient intake, higher school enrollment and attendance of female students, and reduce the incidence of indebtedness. The study showed that consumption of pulses went up, fresh vegetables, meat, which is your main source of protein, went up among these beneficiaries. Now, this evidence challenges the commonly held views. These are the commonly held views which stand against the concept of basic income being given by the government, which are basically that a universal basic income is basically an affront to the dignity of the beneficiaries. Moreover, they could be used for questionable purposes such as buying alcohol or other useless purposes and not for what they were intended. Now, there are some other questions. Why income support and why now? What are the operational design imperatives? What is the fiscal space that can be opened in a sustainable and serious way? Now, this is a pretty straightforward article. We'll go along with what the author says. Why income support right now? Now, she says the reforms since 2019, the reforms since 1991 have basically bypassed agriculture and other segments of economy that engage the poor and rural Indians. The growth in national income has been disproportionate and all individuals have not gained equally. The disproportionate share of gains basically went to the middle class and the rich Indians. This unevenness in development calls for superior economic growth model. Until that happens, redistributive policy interventions such as income transfers can improve equity. Moreover, the author points out an important point that income transfers are not to be confused with doles or unemployment benefits. These are unconditional income supplements to compensate for policy failures and ease the economic anxieties of the less advantaged. In the West, economies are advocating universal basic income to fight inequality and slow wage growth. Allay fears that immigrants will take away jobs and advance automation. Besides, there's also an urgent need to address rural distress, largely a consequence of policy failures such as ineffective procurement and perverse trade and pricing policies. Rural distress. What is rural distress? We'll discuss rural distress in very brief. Rural distress is basically the falling rural wages or incomes due to excessive supply, which is quite ironic. Excessive supply, which has led to a fall in prices far below the MSP. Fall in prices far below the MSP. Moreover, what is MSP? MSP is the minimum price at which the government will procure food from you in case there is a fall in prices. However, the procurement capacity of the government is limited. Therefore, not all the production or all that has been produced can be procured by the government. Due to this limited procurement, the farmers are forced to sell these food grains in the market where the prices are driven by the forces of supply and demand. This has led to falling rural wages or income, which has become a major cause of rural distress. Now, she says there's an urgent need to address rural distress, which is largely a consequence of policy failures such as ineffective procurement. This is what she's talking about, and perverse trade and pricing policies, which is the pricing of MSP. Now, at least two states, Telangana and Orissa, are already experimenting in a limited way. Telangana has come up with a Raitu Bandhu scheme, which is basically an income support payment at the rate of rupees 10,000 per hectare. However, this model is basically benefiting the biggest landowners and tenants and sharecroppers and landless laborers, the most vulnerable, are basically out of its coverage. Moreover, the success of this scheme, Raitu Bandhu, depends upon reliable land records. Odisha's scheme, Kalia, which is Krishak Assistance for Livelihood and Income Assistance, iron out these creases. It proposes to transfer rupees 5,000 cash per season to the state's 30 lakh marginal farmers, leaving out the 2 lakh large farmers. It promises cash grants of rupees 12,500 each to the state's 10 lakh households. Last year, the budget had promised compensatory payments to farmers equal to the gap between depressed market prices and the MSPs announced. This is what we were talking about, which that is depressed market prices are basically the prices which fall below the MSP, driven by the forces of supply and demand. And in cases of excessive supply, there is a fall in the prices much below the MSP. However, she says the Raitu Bandya and Kalia are superior policy interventions. Now, plus they do not suffer from the moral hazard and limited reach of farm loan waivers. Waivers penalize farmers. Now, she says these are important points, you can note them down. Waivers basically penalize farmers who pay on time, whereas they benefit the borrowers from banks. Only borrowers from banks, which means the formal sources of credit. Whereas most of the small and marginal farmers basically rely on informal sources of credit or unorganized sources of credit, such as your money lenders or the etc. And moreover, she says the advantage of minimum income guarantee will be that it will also cover the urban poor, which the universal basic income, as we had discussed yesterday. The other form of universal, the diluted form of universal basic income, which is QBRI, which is quasi-universal rural, quasi-universal basic rural income, which covers only your rural poor and not the urban poor. So the author says that the advantage of minimum income guarantee is that it will also cover the urban poor who are not covered in these schemes. While these job guarantee schemes such as Manrega lock up beneficiaries low productivity work, income supplements allow them to continue to look for better employment options. Now she talks about opening up of fiscal space, which is basically talking about whether the Indian government can afford the fiscal costs of such schemes such as your basic or minimum income to the poor. We'll move on to the next article, which is GST. This is again from the Hindu. This is GST revenues going off target. Now, with tax rates, this basically pertains to the 31st GST Council meeting, which had taken place on December 22nd, where the GST rates had been cut down on a number of items, as we'll see in this article. Now, the author points out that with the author basically is saying that the GST revenues have been as usual, not as usual, they have been low. So how? So basically, the cut down of rates in this in the 31st GST Council meeting would lead to further fall in the government revenue. Now why this is a worrisome thing, we'll see in this article. She says that GST collection for the author is basically saying that the GST collection for January 2019 will come in at 94,000 to 96,000 crores, which is lower than the year's average and far lower than what the experts estimate the government should be getting. The collections or the GST collections have crossed the rupees 1 lakh crore mark only twice in the 9 months under consideration. Even this was lower than the 1.1 lakh crore the tax analyst said the government should be getting. Moreover, in the December 22nd meeting, which was the 31st GST Council meeting, the GST Council cut GST rates on a number of items and services. Therefore, this would lead to a further fall in revenue in January as compared to December. Why is this happening? Now she says in the 31st Council, the GST rates have been cut down on almost 20 categories of goods and services, leaving behind only one common use item, which is cement, in the highest tax slab of 28%. The 28% slab in the GST rates had been was created to basically offset the lower collections from the items that were made exempt from GST or put in the lower slab of 5%. Naturally, a reducing number of items in the 28% slab will result in lower collections. The way to offset lower rate, now she says, the author further says that the way to offset lower rates, that is, the way to offset lower rates, which will lead to lower revenue, is to basically increase the number of people who are paying the tax. That is, the way to offset lower rates would be to increase the compliance. That is, the number of people who are paying the tax. But she says that in the period in which the number of people who are filing their monthly return has grown, in that same period, the number of people who are not filing their returns has grown even much more. That is, the number of non-filers is growing much faster than the tax base itself. Tax base is the number of people who are basically filing their taxes. The government seems to have identified another reason for falling revenues. The government is basically saying that the business is generating fake invoices. Invoices are basically your bills. That is, the businesses are generating fake invoices to claim higher input tax credits than they should be receiving. Now, input tax credit is something which we should understand. An input tax credit is basically, we'll understand this through a process. This is your diagram for understanding the input tax credit. Suppose you're manufacturing this product, and for manufacturing this product, you require three inputs: A, B, and C. Now, the tax for purchasing, first you will need to acquire these inputs, right? The tax for purchasing product A was rupees 100. The tax for purchasing product B was rupees 120. The tax for purchasing the input C is rupees 80. The combined tax comes out to rupees 300. Now, you combine all these inputs and you manufacture your output. The tax on the output which you have paid is basically rupees 450 to the government. Now, what is input credit? Input credit is basically the tax which has the total tax that has to be paid by the manufacturer, which is rupees 450 less the tax which has been paid on the inputs. That is, the final tax that you pay as a manufacturer minus the tax which is already being paid on your inputs. This becomes your input credit. Now, that the businesses are generating fake invoices to claim higher input tax credits than they should be receiving has been cited as the primary reason by the government for the falling revenues. The root of this problem is that the government does not have an easy and accessible way to match the invoices of sellers and buyers and catch the discrepancies. This system likely to be rolled out from April 2019 onwards, but there is no official clarity on what it will involve. Why is this worrisome? Falling GST revenues themselves are a worrisome prospect because they put pressure on the government finances, right? Because what is the government revenue basically? Basically, the government revenue is basically a taxation, which comprises of your direct taxation and indirect taxation. The author says if your indirect tax collections are falling, naturally you'll have to increase your direct tax collections to compensate or to offset the fall in indirect tax collections. Therefore, they put the pressure on the government finances, especially on the other sources of revenue. Direct tax calculations have been growing at a robust pace, but this being an election year, the government will be hard pressed to reduce the personal income tax rates in the general budget. Weak GST revenues also limit the government's ability to provision enough resources for any budgetary support, say the agriculture sector or the MSME sector. Pretty straightforward. Moving on with the next article, this is basically gold rush. Tightening monetary policies in the West and the supply factors have led to a spurt in gold prices. In this article, the author is basically saying, he's basically pointing out towards the reasons which are leading to a rise in the prices of gold. Now, this is an article which should be understood from the perspective of economy. Why are the prices of gold rising? The author is basically pointing to two factors. One is your supply factors, that is, this is basically your basic demand and supply, which forms the basis of economy. When there's a fall in supply and increasing a mismatch between demand and supply, when the demand is high and the supply is low, there will be automatic increase in the prices. This is one reason which the author points out. Further, he says that tightening monetary policies What are tightening monetary policies? A tightening monetary policy implies basically, tightening means squeezing out money from the market. Now, how will a bank do this? This will be done by increasing interest rates. When the banks increase the interest rates, your loans become expensive. Therefore, your borrowing becomes expensive, which basically sucks out money from the market. This leads to squeezing out money, and this is called a tightening monetary policies. However, rising interest rates become attractive from the perspective of investors for these markets, especially a financially stable market such as US will yield higher and guaranteed returns to the investors. Therefore, what happens is when the US Federal Reserve, or as in the article the author points out, the Western central banks raise the interest rates, raise your interest rates, there is a capital outflow from the emerging market economies. This leads to weakening of the emerging market economies currency. A case in point would be your Indian rupee, which has seen a significant fall when compared with your dollar. This is your second reason for rising prices of gold. This is all there is in this article. You can read this article yourself. Moving on further, now this was another point which came near the Hindu. This is basically important from your pre-perspective, and there is nothing much to cover in this article. And from the UPSC perspective, all that you are required to know is that Beveridge curve basically refers to a graphical representation that shows the relationship between your unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. This is your unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, and this is your vacancies. And moreover, this Beveridge curve usually slopes downwards. That is sloping downwards, which basically because let us just try and understand this graph. Let us take this point on the graph. What does it basically point out to? On unemployment axis, the unemployment rate is very high, and if you draw a parallel to the horizontal axis, this implies that the number of job vacancies is low. Basically, low vacancies. Therefore, the companies will not hire as many people, and therefore there will be high unemployment. Similarly, if we take another point on the graph, let us take a point here. What does this basically mean? This means there is low unemployment while there are high number of vacancies. Again, you have large number of vacancies, therefore companies will be willing to hire large number of people, and therefore be a very low unemployment. This is your basically Beveridge curve. Moving further, now we'll move on to the articles of the Indian Express. This article is basically hide and seek. What is the author talking about here? She's saying the Union government has delayed the release of official statistics, tried to fudge numbers. This has direct consequences for addressing the unemployment crisis. Now, what does this basically article pertain to? This article is talking about the resignation of the only remaining two independent members of the National Statistical Commission on Wednesday raised several questions over the way the government is treating inconvenient economic data. Basically, there has been a lot of complaints about the government about the rising job crisis or a jobless growth. Now, the National Statistical Commission, which had basically prepared certain data, was stopped from releasing it by the government. This had led to the resignation of the only two independent directors on the team. This points to what could be. This basically speculates. Let us go through the article. The attacks by the Narendra Modi government on India's institutions have been noted, but the destruction of India's statistical system was not adequately recognized or condemned. That is, not until the latest revelations on how the government refusing to release the NSSO's employment survey for 2016-17 led to the resignation of the last two independent members of the National Statistical Commission. There is not much here from the perspective of UPSC. However, we'll go through quickly what this article is saying. The self-created mess is worst. See, why are official statistics first of all important? Official statistics are basically important because it denies this attack. It is important because it helps the citizenry gauge the performance of the Indian economy and how the government is basically performing on the economic front or the job front. This is sad because India had managed to build one of the most impressive statistical systems in the developing world. Moreover, this attack on official statistics is counterproductive even for the government because effective policy making requires proper knowledge of existing conditions and problems. The self-created mess is worse for the official data on employment. First, the NSSO was made to scrap the quinquennial large labor force survey. What is quinquennial? Basically means which happens every 5 years. The NSSO was made to scrap the 5-year large labor force survey on the grounds that it shall be replaced with periodic labor force surveys. Basically, the government said that we shall be needing surveys more frequently to measure the growth of the economy or the growth of jobs. Therefore, they had decided to replace or scrap the quinquennial large labor force survey, replacing it with the periodic labor force surveys that would provide real-time data or more frequent data as compared to the previous one. The report of 2016 survey is ready and was cleared by the National Statistics Commission. However, the government did not release it. Moreover, similarly, the Labour Bureau's report of the 6th Annual Employment and Unemployment Survey, also for 2016-17, has not been publicly released by the government. We can only speculate about whether this is because these surveys show stagnation or decline in employment in the recent past, still pertain mostly to the period before demonetization. It may reflected existing. See, this is not a very important article, but you can go through it if you want to. We'll move further. Why government must spend more? Private consumption, investment demands must rise, and cash transfers, lower income tax slabs, greater liquidity in financial sector will boost growth. Here, the author is basically talking about why the government must spend more to boost growth in the Indian economy. In this paragraph, the author basically points out how the position of the Indian economy at the end of the term of Congress, which was UPA 2, which ended in 2014. In 2014, towards the end of UPA 2, India was part of a group that was informally referred to as Fragile Five, countries being the weakest links in the global economy. The Modi government went about managing its financial affairs in a very prudent way. Prudent meaning unnecessary expenditures were curtailed, such as curtailing unnecessary subsidies and etc. The falling global oil prices were leveraged to generate better revenue for the government. Demonetization and GST were launched, establishing audit trail and ownership of money and simplification in the indirect tax structure, which is the GST. Macroeconomic parameters like inflation and fiscal deficit have been contained, which is true. Current account deficit is also manageable. What is fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit is basically the total revenues of the government minus the total expenditure. Fiscal deficit basically is your total expenditure of the government minus total revenue. The fiscal term basically relates to expenses of government. So total expenditure minus total revenue, whenever the expenditure is more than the total revenue, it leads to a fiscal deficit. Deficit is a negative. And this basically, fiscal deficit basically reflects the borrowings that shall be required by the government. So the author is saying that the fiscal deficit, or the author has noted that the fiscal deficit has been contained. What is current account deficit? Current account deficit is basically a measure of the trade of a country. It is reflective of trade, and it is basically imports minus your exports. If your imports are more and exports less, imports require paying, therefore it is an expenditure. Exports will lead to pay, which is basically a gain. So if your imports are more than your export, you'll have a current account deficit. Therefore current account deficit is basically reflective of trade. Foreign exchange reserves and GDP growths are inching higher. The government does not sacrifice any essential expenditure. As per the publicly available data, the 2014-15 to 2018-19 period has seen the best combination of GDP growth rate and inflation. Not only India is not only one of the fastest growing economy, but also the sixth largest economy. Moreover, according to PwC's annual Global Economic Watch report, India's real GDP growth in 2019-20 is projected at 7.6%, which is likely to surpass UK in 2019, and India will finally occupy the fifth position among the size of the economies of the world. However, the author further says that it is not the priority of the government to chase macroeconomic parameters such as inflation, fiscal deficit, or GDP growth. Rather, the central point of every development or every growth in the economy is to ameliorate the condition of the ordinary citizen of India. The target is to achieve a higher level of GDP growth while making it as wide, that is, as inclusive and participative as possible. Currently, agriculture and allied sectors are facing some challenges due to lack of sufficient demand. Moreover, the MSME sector is another segment that is facing liquidity crunch, which was seen significantly after demonetization. Increased demand brings in private investment, and if there is resource constraint with the government, fiscal expansion is the way out. This is where he comes to the central point of the article, which is that the government must spend more. The economy will grow only when there is sufficient demand. The government expenditure has increased tremendously in the past years, and sectors like steel and cement have benefited immensely. However, private consumption and investment demands need to increase further. Further, there is scope for expansionary fiscal policies, particularly when the inflation is low. The government might consider measures like interest subvention in agriculture loans, direct cash transfer, relaxing income tax slabs, injection of liquidity, which is what he had said in the subtitles of the in the subtitle of the topic. Cash transfer to farmers are constrained by lack of updated land records with the state governments, and way around it must be found. Such a transfer will boost demand for agricultural and non-agricultural products in the rural areas. Moreover, it will help the agricultural and the MSME sectors. That's all the articles for today. Thank you and have a good day.